Welcome to Hodge Hill Church and our Lent series, God in the Ruins. Welcome to those of you here on site, and welcome to those who are joining the conversation online. And a huge thank you to Reverend Sarah Lamming, who is hosting the online space tonight. And a special welcome, we can see him on our screen here, to Professor Anthony Reddie, who's joining us from Waco, Texas in the USA, where he is currently teaching and preaching, among other things. I'll say a bit more to introduce Anthony and the series in a moment or two, but first I'm delighted to welcome Alison Webster, General Secretary of Modern Church, who have been a generous sponsor and supporter of this series, particularly helping us to bring it to those of you who are online. Alison, going to come and say a few words.
Welcome, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. I've heard a lot. I'm just saying, I've heard a lot about this church from Al over the years in various different contexts. So it's actually really brilliant to be here in person. When Al first started posting, oh, and hello, Anthony. You can hear me. Anthony and I have known each other since being young Methodists in another century. Yeah, when Al started posting details of this Lent course, it was quite a while ago, wasn't it? 6 months. You were incredible. We were all gobsmacked. I was thinking, how has Al put this together? It's just so amazing. For those who don't know, Modern Church is a progressive theological association, membership association. So if you are into exploring theological ideas in an open way where you can say whatever you want and whatever you believe is for you, and it's an exploratory space, it felt like there was a natural synergy between what Al had put together and what Modern Church is about. So I got in touch with Al and said, and also people were posting, oh, that looks fantastic, but I live in, I don't know, Norfolk or Wales. Is there going to be an online element? So we got talking, and I know Modern Church and I think Queen's Foundation have both put in just a bit of financial resources to enable this to go wherever we want it to go. So it's brilliant. I won't say any more because I don't want to cut Anthony's time, but it's fantastic to be here tonight, and there are so many people online.
Thanks, Alison. So why are we here? And why is it called God in the Ruins? What if the world is ending? Or at least, what if it is the end of the world as we know it? For many on our planet, it's not even a question. For the people of Gaza, for the human and non-human casualties of climate change and species extinction, to name those caught up in just two of the world's deadliest crises. But for those of us with the luxury of being able to ask it, what if it's the end of the world as we know it for us? Well, that might mean that much that has felt familiar, reassuringly secure, is crumbling away. The institutions we were meant to rely on, the structures of our society, of church, of global economic and political systems, structures shaped, as we'll be reminded sharply over the coming weeks, by white supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, ableism, and the ecocidal forces of modernity, coloniality. Structures of what poet Audre Lorde concisely named the master's house. And if it is crumbling, then we know tragically that many, many lives are disproportionately vulnerable in its downfall, just as they have been disproportionately vulnerable while it has stayed standing for far too long. For those of us for whom the world as we know it has brought some benefits, the crumbling of its structures might well be scary, painful in different ways. But what if amidst the crumbling of the master's house, a different kind of life might be springing up amongst the ruins? What if, as the prophetic Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai put it, a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood? It's that double what if. What if the world is ending? What if some other kind of life is emerging that shapes this Lent series? In a season of the year for Christians that pays particular attention to what is dying, to what we need to let go of, and to where we need to turn to look for life. What Christians have often called repentance. So over the weeks to come, we'll look at some different aspects of these crumbling structures in the church as well as in the wider world. Capitalism and class exploitation, heteropatriarchy and institutional homophobia, the climate crisis and its starkly unequal causes and effects, and the mental health struggles for so many of us within this dying and deadly world. But tonight we begin by shining the spotlight on the deadly entanglement of whiteness, empire, and mission. And to help us do that, I'm delighted to welcome one of the world's leading Black theologians, the first ever professor of Black theology at the University of Oxford, a wise and generous teacher, and a good friend, Professor Anthony Reddie. Can we give him a big round of applause from Lodge Hill?
Thank you. It's great to be with you, although slightly disconcerting. When this was first envisaged, I was hoping to be with you in person. However, due to dives and various other things, I'm here in Waco, in Texas. I'm here to speak at a conference on racism, in the white church in America. And I'm particularly opposite to be doing that in Texas. For the most part, very, very right-wing and fairly reactionary state within the US. But I've been very, very generously and very hospitably I was looked after really by the wonderful people at Baylor University here in Waco who oversee the event. So I want to say a few words about my book. First, let me start by saying that I do apologize that I'm here by myself. I'm not with my colleague, Carol Troop. Carol was the co-editor of the book, and in many respects, she did most of the heavy lifting on it. And so it's a shame that she was unable to be with us. Initially, she was available for the day, then she wasn't. And then more latterly, she actually was available to come this evening. But because I was then tied up with being here in Texas and also trying to shake off a cold, and apologies if you hear the gravel in the voice, it meant that by the time I got round to trying to reorganize myself, Carol had made other arrangements. So I speak really for both of us because the book was very much a collaborative effort really between myself and Carol Troop and a number of very, very excellent and creative and brave contributors really to the book. So Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. It's probably important if I put this into a historical context. I want to name three, I think, pivotal events that have sort of foreshadowed this book, really for in terms of context, because the book, in some regards, has been a long time coming. So the first pivotal moment, for me anyway, was about 1992, so early 90s. And I remember I was a lay worker in Handsworth, worked for the Methodist Church for Villa Road and Lazarus Methodist churches. I was invited to a consultation on racism that was hosted by Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, CTBI, or it might have been the count. Well, 1992 actually might still be like the British Council of Churches, BCC. But anyway, so it was an ecumenical gathering in London, and the number of us there to talk about racial justice. And what struck me at the time, I was much younger than I am now. I was not a speaker, I was just in the audience, were the number of very, very prominent older white men who did all the talking. And in one regard, that was fine because they were and still are actually some of my heroes, people who were very much in the context of anti-racist Christian activism, very much in the business of naming and shaming Britain's collusion with empire, with colonialism, with racism in the past. This was a very progressive event in '92. But what struck me as being the most obvious thing that no one spoke about was the nature of whiteness itself. That yes, racism impacts upon Black people, and yes, racism as a that goes at the construct of race and the system and structures and procedures and policies that find systemic and systematic ways of reinforcing notions of white privilege and entitlement and power at the expense of those who are not white. In that regard, it was a very, very powerful and a very successful meeting. What was missing was how racism had been constructed in the first place. And even then, back in '92, there are a number of the speakers who were quite rightly saying that the way in which racism is capable of morphing its identity, shape-shifting, finding ways of embedding itself into different practices and traditions, makes it more like a verb than a noun. It's a doing thing, something that almost has a life of its own. And therefore, you can't assume that it can be slayed in any one generation, taking one particular form of activity. That was '92. I would say about maybe 13, 14 years later, in the mid-2000s, I was on the staff of the Queen's Foundation as a research fellow. And one of the ordinands at the time, now the Reverend Rachel Webley, Rachel was an ordinand at the time, Anglican ordinand. And I believe she started, I think it's, that's my knowledge, the first ever white group. So she started a white group in the college as a way of white students responding primarily to the teaching of Dr. Mukti Barton. So Mukti Barton was a tutor in Black and Asian theology. And her work really was very much about foregoing the development of Black liberation theology, both within the Caribbean and in the British context, taking in some of the insights from North America, but also taking the insights from the Asian continent where she was from. She was originally from the Punjab, I believe. And those classes used to always have a very visceral impact on the predominantly white student body of Queens at the time. And I think Rachel, being a very, very progressive white ally, was, I think, at the forefront of starting this group. It didn't outlast her. I think when she had left to go into parish, I think the group soon folded. But that was an important marker, I think, for someone wanting to ask critical questions around not just this amorphous thing called race and racism, but also in what ways is it underpinned by whiteness? So what was it underpinned by white privilege and a sense of entitlement? And then finally, in April 2021, myself, Al Barrett, and Jill Marsh, the three of us, organized a conference called Dismantling Whiteness, that today is still one of the biggest remote conferences I think I've ever organized. I think we had somewhere in the region of 300 people actually join us, and about 20 odd different speakers. And I'm greatly indebted to both my colleagues, both to Al Barrett and to Jill Marsh, for helping to organise that conference. And then out of that came a number of papers that was published in a special issue of Practical Theology. So there's been a long kind of hinterland, really, before we can end up with this book called Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. So central to the book itself, which really comes out of some work that I was doing for the Council for World Mission at the time. I worked for the Council for World Mission for 9 months. They are a ecumenical body that oversees a number of member churches. I think it's 34 member churches that largely come out of the Presbyterian, Reformed and Congregationalist family, ecclesial family. And in the previous iteration, they were the London Missionary Society, the LMS. and they were had an overall project around deconstructing empire. And so once I had left to start my current job in Oxford University, I persuaded them to let me do some research work as a part of their commitment to looking at deconstructing empire, to think about the legacies of the past, very crucial for them as a mission body that has tentacles in mission and colonial expansion in Africa, and particularly in the Pacific, in the 18th and 19th century. As I worked with Carol True, my colleague, who is unable to be with us this evening, as I said. And so when the book was first being developed, one of the things that Carol and I wanted to do was to bring together a number of predominantly white authors. I would say probably about 3/4 of the authors are white, and to look at a number of areas. So we looked at theological education, perspectives in history, particularly mission history. There's some personal explorations of white authors themselves, and then explorations into the phenomenon of whiteness. And what we wanted to do was a number of things, really. Firstly, and I think perhaps the most important thing to say, is that the developing ways in which we talk about whiteness are not primarily about skin color. It's not primarily about people who are racialized as white. So it's not particularly attack on white people. That's one of the arguments and pushback that came from the online conference that we did in 2001. And it's very interesting how the nature of racism operates. There were 3 of us organized, of whom 2 of them were white. And the actual title, Dismantling Racism, was actually a title that came from Jill Marsh. But the only person who received hate content was me, of the 3 of us. And one of the pushbacks were from people who were going to report me to the police because it was a hate crime, so they were saying, because like we were attacking white people. Well, firstly, 2 of the 3 organizers were white, and actually most of the speakers were white. So unless they were engaging in a process of self-hate, it wasn't actually attacking anyone. So to be very clear at this juncture, what the book is doing is looking at the phenomena of whiteness. How has the world been shaped by the presumptions that come out of, particularly predominantly Europe and America, and how we see the world, who is normalized by the world, who is given forms of entitlement, opportunity, who gets to define what is truth, who has a sense of self-determination and agency. Now, whiteness is a very, very complex phenomenon. And one of the first things we realized when putting the book together was to have a variety of voices that would speak from a variety of perspectives, because there's no one particular experience or one particular account that can help to define what is whiteness. And so obviously in the book we have some authors who are writing from more working class backgrounds, some who are writing from non-conformist backgrounds, who would say that their experience is also to be on the margins and not to be part of a metropolitan elite and not to be part of a privileged group. And that is entirely right and proper. We did not censor any of the articles or tell people what to write or how to frame their contributions to the book. But I think it is important to say about what I mean by white entitlement. Because one of the gifts of being white is not having to think about it. It's being able to get on with your life and construe your identity in a whole variety of ways, but not have to talk about the marker of what it is to be white in ways that people who are not white don't have that same privilege. So a poor white working class person will have innumerable challenges in the world, things that will be impediments to their progress, things that will hold them back, things that will stop their sense of affirmation and any notion of progress. But to be clear, one of those challenges will not be being white. And there's no evidence anywhere where anyone can show me conclusively in empirical terms that being white has ever had a negative deleterious effect on the people who are racialized as white. So partly it's to talk about, so what does it mean then about to be almost in one sense invisible? To be able to go through the world and not to have to overly worry about how people are identifying you just on the basis of being white itself, as opposed to other characteristics, which will be real and which will be of issue and concern. Although it's worth saying that those other issues that will be of concern will be ones that will be shared by other people as well. So people say, well, actually, we need to take class and poverty into account. Absolutely. But let's be honest with you, global majority of people are also suffer from issues of class and poverty. Disability, absolutely. But again, every other category outside of whiteness is one that can relate to every other group that has those same problems, but none of the advantages of being white. Key to the book was to get people to tell their stories and to self-identify themselves in however ways they wanted to, and to be honest about their own articulation of not just the issue itself, but how that is understood theologically. Therefore, one of the important aspects of the book is this very, very simple dictum that is said by James Cone, who is often identified as the grand patriarch, the father of Black liberation theology. Cone says, God does not do theology. Theology is done by human beings. It's human speech about God. Therefore, if one takes that proposition seriously, then there's something about our lived experience, the social location from which we write, the context in which we find ourselves, the places that have shaped us, and the places on our metaphorical and sometimes physical, literal journeys. Sometimes anthropologists and scholars call it the root and the root. I shared this the other day in a lecture I gave in Texas, and I had to remind myself that it doesn't quite work in American English. In English, it's a nice alliteration, root and root. But in American English, it's root and route, so it's not quite the same thing. But in principle, it's about how do we hold in tension those places that have shaped us, those places that have been our point of departure, the root, our ROOT, and hold them in tension with the things we learn as the ROUTE, the things that we learn on our journeys. And that's important because I think one of the things that Carol and I, as the editors, believed in, and certainly the reason why we chose some of the key people to be interlocutors, to be dialogue partners in the book, is the belief that whiteness can be remade, not fixed. As human beings, we have the ability to remake ourselves, to reimagine ourselves, to reconstruct our identities, that all human identities are fluid, that cultures are fluid, and we can think about the past in particular ways, and we can think about our current agency and our imagined future in particular ways as well. And so one of the things we encourage the writers to do in their autobiographical reflections is to say something about their own development, their own shifting of identity from their formative beginnings to where they are now, and what has changed. In what ways has their understanding of their own whiteness been shaped by their social context and history? It's often said that we are the sum of the stories we tell about ourselves. And so what are the stories that we tell about ourselves that help us to understand who we are, that give us a sense of identity? We looked at different categories, as I said. In a very selfish context, I guess the one that perhaps spoke to me initially as the most important, not saying it's the most important in the book, but it spoke to me certainly as an educator, was the first chapter, or the first set of chapters where we look at decolonizing theological education. And we were really blessed to have some very, very important writers like Mike Crichton and David Clough and Eve Parker as a writing in that chapter. And they were very much talking about their experiences, as very knowledgeable individuals who have been engaged in the teaching of academic theology, both within faith-based institutions and within slightly more secular ones. And acknowledging that the process by which many of our processes to create people to become ministers, for example, Queen's been a very notable place where I spent 13 years of my life working, are places that have been shaped by whiteness. Perhaps the most foundational text for this book has been Willie James Jennings' book, After Whiteness. And so we have been blessed to have Willie James Jennings as one of the people who has very, very kindly endorsed the book, because numerous writers cite Jennings as being hugely influential, both in terms of his coining of the phrase whiteness as a phenomenon, as the sea in which we are all living. So he has this wonderful way of moving from, think about whiteness in terms of individual groups, particularly in terms of, let's say, white forms of extremism, like the Ku Klux Klan or the National Front or the British National Party. Yes, they are all indeed very, very violent and very toxic forms of whiteness, but they are very much a minority. Most white people are nothing like that. And therefore, if one is defining whiteness in terms of those forms of extremism, it then becomes problematic, because most ordinary people quite rightly will say, but that's nothing to do with me. And so Jennings has been very skillful in saying, actually, if we move away from thinking primarily about phenotypes, about skin, and then looking more at this as a phenomenon in terms of embedded cultures, traditions, one of the key things Jennings talks about is this notion of mastery and control. That one of the things that comes out of the ethos of whiteness is this sense of being able to control events, being able to have some level of autonomy and agency to control and define and oversee and name. So think of the whole process of colonization. In 1884-1885, at the Treaty of Berlin, all the European powers turned up to carve up the map of Africa. And the strange thing about that was, well, to see, it was not strange at the time, only strange now in hindsight, is that there was not one Black African person present when those maps were being recalibrated. So the whole continent gets defined in terms of people then get named and get put into places, artificial countries that get constructed have nothing to do with where people's sense of kinship or sense of identity was held in terms of ethnic groups. But all of those things are utterly disregarded and obliterated as a map of a continent is formed by a group of people, none of whom are indigenous to that place. And they got to define it. You could never imagine, for example, the opposite happening to Europe. So let's say like a group of Africans turn up one day and say, you know, like we're going to colonize Europe and we're going to define where lines are. It would be simply ridiculous. And yet we still live with the legacy of that in terms of a whole continent. But that's just one very, very marked example. Another key section of the book that is is perhaps the most contested of all in terms of speaking to this book in different groups has been the question around how we think about history. And particularly how we think about mission history and the history of the churches and its relationship to colonialism and empire. I say controversial because, for the most part, most of the field of mission studies is relatively conservative. Most people who do it are people who are largely apologists, who want to defend not only what Britain did, but even more cogently, I think, to defend the belief that this was part of God's agency and this was part of God's providence for the world and for peoples. And we reject that wholeheartedly. And so in the book, although we have a variety of voices, and again, we didn't tell people what to write. Some are slightly, I wouldn't say conservative voices, some are slightly more moderate voices, but even those voices, helpfully, are still offering a sense of nuance and complexity. To say that, actually, one of the difficulties of going back to reread history is always the danger of a kind of revisionism. That we go back and we read and we interpret through the lens of what we now see to be normative, and through the lens of what we have come to understand in the intervening period, not understanding it within the context of the worldviews of the people at the time and what seemed normal to them. That is controversial, as I said, because certainly within Oxford there have been notable academics. Thinking of some like the recently retired Professor Nigel Bigger, who will believe that colonialism was a providential gift that God had given to lesser peoples, obviously through the aegis of British colonialism. We reject his thesis completely. And the book is very, very clear that what it is doing is to unmask the privilege of whiteness and entitlement, because unless you are deconstructing that, then you can't see how much of an imposition actually colonialism and Western mission were, irrespective of whether they did well or not. So one of the arguments I often make when I give talks about this is that I'm not interested in how well like the British ran the railways or how much like they brought in good education and medicine. Like they did all those things, and I'm not disputing that. But let's again, if we turn that on its head and we look at our context, we know full well in terms of the phenomenon of Brexit, if someone could prove that foreigners coming here would improve our lives immeasurably in all kinds of clear metrics, whole set significant numbers of British people would reject it out of hand just on the basis that we don't want foreigners telling us what to do. So we don't care actually whether it's going to make us better or not. On a matter of principle, there is no price that can be paid or given to one's sense of self-determination. Now, here's the thing. If that is something that is core to the essential identity of white British people, then what makes you think that other people therefore deserve any less in their context? And so our book wrestles head on with the way in which white entitlement and privilege is built right into the very essence of how we often think about mission, Christian mission, and its relationship to colonialism and empire. And then finally, in the last two sections, we encouraged a number of our white contributors to be honest about themselves and just to talk about something of their own journey and their own narration. That's quite important, certainly for me, because one of the things I have been asked to do on innumerable occasions in the past as a way of trying to do racial justice. So people say, Anthony, tell me your story. And so you end up telling your story of experiencing racism, of growing up in my case, Bradford, West Yorkshire, and finding that irrespective of whether people were evangelicals or liberals, progressive or conservative, Labour or conservative or Lib Dems, there was still an element of presumption around racism in how they treated people like myself and my siblings and my extended family. What would often happen, which is why I don't do it anymore, was firstly people would then have asked you to tell your story, then want to dispute it with you and somehow deny you the fact that what you have told is your truth, and then that they want to question your truth. Sometimes people would say, but I just don't simply believe that it's true. Or they want to reinterpret your story for you. And after a while, I began to ask myself, but why is it you're asking me to tell my story? Why are people telling their stories? Actually, what is your story of engaging with the nature of white privilege or racism? What is the nature of your ability not to have to account for your own sense of development and learn experience? If we are supposed to be in this together as part of the body of Christ, as part of people who are in this shared experience of journeying together in pilgrimage, following the risen Christ. So it's been really quite moving to read the accounts of many colleagues and friends as they have recounted their experiences and shown that whiteness comes in many guises. But here's the good news, that the book is not about asking people to feel guilty about things that they've inherited and grown into, but to say all of us have agency, all of us have the ability to determine how we will engage with other people. All of us have the ability to be a transparent person whose life witnesses to the presence of Christ in it, in a way that goes beyond and refutes and challenges all the erroneous lines and structures and definitions that are imposed on us by notions of race and racism. Final thing to say is that there are some authors, not many, but some authors who are from the global majority heritage, or who are of global majority heritage, and really their role is to write and to speak back to whiteness as people in solidarity with the vast majority of the authors who are indeed white. I've been pleased with how the book has been received. For the most part, it has been. It's a book of its moment, and by that I mean that although there's been that long hinterland really from 1992 when I first went to this BCC/CTBI meeting around racial justice in 1992, through to Rachel Webley starting the group on whiteness at Queen's in the mid-2000s, to the Dismantling Whiteness conference, and to the book. It's been a long journey, but it has arrived at the right time when there has been a greater appetite for people to want to engage with it. If we'd have tried it 10 years early, I suspect it would have been a very, very different reception, and we'd be having a very different conversation than the one we're having now. Yes, that's the book. I would say of the edited and co-edited books I've done over the years, I've done quite a few. This has been the most enjoyable to do, to work on, and that's because all the authors were fantastic. They got their stuff in on time, and they did exactly what Carol and I had hoped that they would do. And so it's a book that I feel very, very proud of to have my name on the front. I apologize again for the mix-up of my own tardiness. That means that Carol is not here with us to share her perspectives, because, as I said, she did most of the heavy lifting. And thank you again to all the contributors, some of whom are in this Zoom meeting, particularly thinking of Al, for example, who has a wonderful chapter with Ruth Harley in the book. And so thank you for everyone who helped the book to become what it has become, and I hope it will be an ongoing resource as we journey together, striving to overcome this false dictum of race and to live as the one race that truly exists, which is the human race. Thank you very much.
Anthony, thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour of what is really quite a thick book, and for placing it within that context of a longer story, both your own story, but also a story of this country, of theology, of the Christian church, of the world.
Yeah, well, first let me say I have really enjoyed listening to all the different comments, and and actually in some regards I've been quite heartened by the silence that has not punctuated the conversation, because that tells me that people are taking it seriously. I think one of the challenges of trying to have conversations about whiteness is the reaction of white people. And certainly when that was first tried, let's say over a dozen years ago, what tended to happen was either belligerent anger or a kind of defensive sense of guilt, and neither is particularly constructive. And so I found it interesting that there's been a lot of thoughtful silence, certainly as I've interpreted it, looking at the screen. And as I say, I think that is helpful because this is a long process. We have a lot of, collectively as human beings, a lot of unlearning to do, but we can relearn new things. And the truth is that whiteness has impacted upon all of us. I mean, one thing that Willie James Jennings says is that a way of understanding our present moment, if you look at the front bench of the Conservative Party, it is diverse. It's more diverse than anything that the supposedly more progressive Labour Party have ever come up with. And its diversity therefore tells you that identity politics, as helpful as they are never the final and ultimate solution for how we are seeking to overturn injustice, because actually what we see in that particular context is effectively people of African and Asian descent who have inherited forms of privilege and entitlement that are analogous to forms of whiteness in terms of their operating within a construct, overseeing policies that would be no different than if posh white people were doing. And therefore one could argue that they are as much a manifestation of whiteness as Margaret Thatcher was 40 years ago. And so therefore what I also want therefore to say is that we need intersectionality. Now intersectionality, as I often say, I'm doing some training at the moment for the URC Church. And there's one of two ways in which we can respond when we say these things are interconnected to other issues. It can either be, at worst, a kind of whataboutery. So, so I want to talk about race, and suddenly the white people I'm talking to want to talk about everything but that. So suddenly people want to talk about interfaith. It's like, yeah, but 5 minutes ago, you weren't interested in that, but now you're interested in interfaith, you're interested in class, you're interested in sexuality. And all these are valid things, but at their worst, they become forms of evasion. They become ways of steering the conversation away from the very thing that most white people don't want to talk about. But at their best, what they can bring is potential, if not empathy, then sympathy. At their best, what they say is these are not the same things, but their roots are very similar. It's about issues of power. Who gets to be described as normal? Who gets to be the template that others have to follow? And who are the ones who are demonized and seen as a problem? And whilst therefore sexuality or LGBTQ or trans are not the same as issues around Black identity, they are more alike than unalike. So I don't resist intersectionality. I'm just very careful around how it's constructed, and is it a form of aversion or is it a form of potential sympathy, allyship, and even empathy? Finally, it's about recognition that it's an ongoing journey. I love the quote from Martin Luther King Jr. where it says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It's bending very slowly, and the arc looks like it may be sort of meandering forever from here and until it gets to justice. But I think what I know what keeps me going in this work is ultimately my understanding of the cross. And my understanding of the cross is not to spiritualize it or to effuse over it as if it's not without some deep resonances in terms of the suffering of people. But ultimately, what it tells us is that, that in the end, God's good news for love and affirmation of humanity will always have the last word over hate and death. That God will have the last word. And we are encouraged to walk in solidarity with God in Christ and the power of the Spirit in all those whether they're named Jesus or not, or whether they are doing the radical work of being in community with other people. Probably end it there. Sorry, except to say that actually my favourite last word is invariably comes from Bishop Michael Curry, who many of you remember was the one who officiated at Harry and Meghan's wedding, where he says, I've got two pieces of good news. Firstly, Jesus is coming back. Secondly, the 1950s are not coming back.
There was a round of applause from the room in Hodge Hill Church for that last comment. Anthony, thank you so much for drawing out some threads from our deep and profound conversation at times. Thank you so much for your contribution earlier this evening. In a moment, we're going to pray, and Joy, one of our leaders here, is going to lead us in that prayer. But firstly, just a huge thank you to all of you, both in the room here and online. It feels like one of those spaces that is both uncomfortable and difficult on the one hand, but also profound and holy on the other. Spaces where we meet each other in our uncertainties and our vulnerabilities. Spaces where we feel able to be maybe just a little bit more honest than we were when we started this conversation. That truly is holy ground. So thank you, all of you, for helping create that together. Just a couple of notices, inevitably. One is a really good kind of offer from here. Our partnership with the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Theological Education here in Birmingham has allowed us, Queen's are hosting follow-up sessions online on Monday evening, 7 till 8:30 p.m. after each of these Wednesday evening talks. We're calling them Now What? A practical theological conversation about next steps. And those conversations on Monday evenings will offer the opportunity to explore the theme further with others, to consider different existing models of action, and ask how what we're discovering might influence our faith and our practice across a whole range of different contexts. For those online, we'll be sending you details for these sessions in the follow-up email from tonight, along with a link to the recording of tonight's talk. You may have noticed we've recorded the question and answer session as well. If you don't want your contribution to that to be part of that recording, please do let us know in the chat online or to me in person if you're in the room tonight. But we're hoping to be able to share as much as possible of Anthony's contribution and our conversation here. And next Wednesday's talk, as Alison flagged up, is from Reverend Luke Lana, drawing on his edited book, Confounding the Mighty, Stories of Church, Social Class and Solidarity. It really is not to be missed. Joy, you're going to lead us in a final prayer from Cole Arthur Riley's new book, Black Liturgies, a prayer for Ash Wednesday.
As Al said, to end tonight's amazing discussion, I'm reading the poem written by Cole Arthur Riley. This poem is for Ash Wednesday, God of the Ashes. Today, let us hold the tension of the story of our making. Born of the dirt, beautifully connected to the earth we walk on, and yet possessing the knowledge of our own mortality, that our common decay cannot be escaped. As we begin Lent, help us to become honest about the ways our societies and selfhoods are marred by injustice, cruelty, neglect, and greed. Help us to see our own role in the degeneration of the world, that as we push back evil around us, we might also admit those secret evils that dwell in us. As we name how we've been complicit in the ashes of this world, help us to bear them in solidarity and hope. Amen.
Thank you all. See some of you Monday night and hopefully many of you next week on Wednesday evening. Good night.